Here's the deal. We're going to jump into a conversation around stewardship, and when we talk about stewardship, everybody gets a little bit uncomfortable, and so that's okay. We're all going to be uncomfortable together. Can we agree with that? Yes, cool. All like 12 of you are going to be uncomfortable with me, but the rest of you can just kind of listen in, and we'll be uncomfortable together. It's okay. Stewardship is really just deciding what to do with what we have. It's really making some decisions about what God has done in our lives and the way that God is doing things through what God has done in our lives. And so we get to be a part of that process. And a lot of times when we start talking about this idea of stewardship, I think we ask a question that all of us are familiar with in some way or another. Because many of us either are young people or we've had young people in our house. And sometimes when we ask our young people in our house to do something, they ask us this brilliant question. What is it? Why? Why? Why do I have to go to bed? Why do I have to do my homework? Why do I have to take a shower? Why do I have to why do I have to do this? Why do I have to do it? Why should I do this instead of that? Why? We get lots of whys when we're raising kids. And all of us as adults, we're like, oh yeah, this is so frustrating, all the kids say why. But the reality is we do the same thing. We ask why questions all the time. Why should I do this? Why should I do that? Why should I get up and go to the gym? Why should I do this? Why should I eat what's right? Why should I do what my doctor told me to do? Why should I do these things? Why should I? I should just be able to do what I want. I should just be like, there's this whole why should I thing. It causes us a little bit of struggle. And so over the next couple of weeks, I want to talk to you guys about this why. Like, why should I even care about the idea of stewardship? Why does this matter? Why should I give of my time and my talents and my gifts? Why should I give out of what God has given to me? Why should I? And I know, like, if you're new to church, you're like, oh, wow, the preacher's going to talk about money. That's a surprise. Again, it makes people very uncomfortable. But I think there's a bigger and a deeper reason beyond just money. Most of us, when we think about stewardship, we immediately go there. We think it's all about the dollar bills, right? That's what we think about when we think about stewardship. We think the pastor is going to ask us to give to something. They're going to give to the church. We're going to give to this. We're going to give to that. Most of the time, when we think about stewardship, we think about what we give to. Right? All of us have heard about this. And I could spend the rest of our time together this morning talking about the reasons that you should give to the church. Because I think you should. I do. I think that you should. I think that everyone should have something that they give to, because there's incredible, amazing things that go on in this community and in this church only because people like me and you give to the church. We give to the church. And we do this all the time. We give to something, like lots of times there'll be certain things that we think about that we give to. We want to give to specific things. So recently we got to pay off the last bit of our loan on the Gibson wing, and lots of us gave to that. We gave extra to pay off the loan. We give to something. We give to a specific project, to a specific ministry, to a specific thing. If we think about the TV ads that work on us, right? They ask us to give to something. There's like a Sarah McLachlan song in the background. In the arms of an angel, right? And there's like a sad dog. And we're like, yes, I'll give to that dog if you'll just stop playing that song. It's making me feel things, and I don't want to feel them. We give to things. All of us feel, we feel good about giving to them. We're about to hit the season where we'll hear the bells outside of the stores. We give to Salvation Army and the work that they're doing, and it's great work. I think we should give to them. We should walk by, put money in the bucket, send them a whatever thing on the internet. How do you do that? What's that called where you send money? Yeah, Cash App, whatever it is. I don't know. We should give to things. It's important. But there's something even more important than that. Because if we're just giving two things, then that's fine, but it doesn't really give us the why we should really do it. I mean, I could talk about all the things that we do here, all the things that you give to. I could talk about the lunches that we provide during the summer. I could talk about the thousands of people that came through Lawrenceville Lights last year because you gave to that project. I could talk about the Christmas store. I could talk about Family Promise. I could talk about the co-op. We could talk about all of the things that we are able to give to and to support because of our willingness to give to the church. We could talk about all of these things that we give to, and that's an important reason, but it's not the reason. I could talk to you about how giving to certain things actually makes us healthier. You know, if I was going to answer, well, why should I could go there. I could say to all of us that it's good for your health. It really is good for your health. There's this wonderful book called The Paradox of Generosity, published by these two scientists, Christian Smith and Hilary Davidson. And they said that generosity practices have a positive correlation to greater well-being. They said the relationship is absolutely clear and consistent, strong enough to make a real difference in people's happiness, health, purpose, mental health, and interest in personal growth. In fact, they go on to say that Americans who describe themselves as very happy volunteer on average of 5.8 hours per month, and those who describe themselves as unhappy, they only volunteer about 0.6 hours a month. They can correlate this to lower depression rates among people who donate to something. We could talk about what it means to donate to and how it correlates positively to our health. Or we could talk about how making sure that we donate to something helps us to move out of this scarcity mindset that so many of us have, right? I remember being early in our marriage, and I tell all of the couples that I get to sit down with before I do their wedding, I say, guys, I'm going to give you the greatest advice you've ever been given. Get a budget, okay? Get a budget. Figure out how you're going to use the money that you have. Get a budget, because giving to helps us to move beyond that place where, we get to the end of the month and we're like, oh no, I should give something to the church. I should give something to somewhere. I should give something. And at the end of the month, we realize that all of that money is somehow magically gone. I remember early in Michelle and I's marriage, we would give in this way. We'd give to something in order to help us try to budget, but we wouldn't budget at the beginning of the month. We'd budget at the end of the month because we had all these bills to pay, and I was a youth pastor, and she was a nanny, and at the end of the month, there just wasn't any money left. In fact, sometimes there was negative money, and I would think to myself, well, hey, God, 10% of a negative number, you owe me something, right? I'm assuming that my bonus check will be in the mail. But it doesn't work that way. Like, when we shifted our focus, when we shifted away from this scarcity mindset, when we really started to budget, and our first gifts were to the church, all of a sudden we knew how much we had. We knew how much was left in the pool, and it helped us to budget everything else as long as we budgeted to something. It moves us beyond kind of this scarcity mindset into seeing a little bit more out of what it is that we have. We could talk about how important that is. But if we read the scriptures, if we really pay close attention, what we find is that there's a bigger, better reason as to why we should practice stewardship. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul is talking to a church for the second time, right? If Paul writes you a letter, you're doing okay. If Paul writes you multiple letters, it means you haven't been doing a great job. And so in the 2 Corinthians, Paul is still talking to this church that had all sorts of issues, all sorts of problems, and he's still working to correct some of those, to invite them into a new way of living, to invite them to experience something more of God. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9, Paul talks about the why. Why should I? He says this, "We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia." That's Thessalonica and Philippi, in case you're taking notes. These other churches in Macedonia. And he goes on to say this, during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity. Let's just rewind. Their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For as I can testify, they voluntarily gave according to their means, and even beyond their means, begging us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to the saints. Paul writes to the Corinthian church, and he says, look, there's these other churches, and God has done something so amazing in their lives that they're begging for the opportunity to give. They're begging for the opportunity to give to this offering that they already knew about that was going to the Jerusalem church, to the people in Jerusalem who had been struggling. Let's think about this for a second. The church really got its starts there in Jerusalem, and now this is another church that had been planted out from Jerusalem that started in this different place, and now they're taking up an offering for the people back in Jerusalem. What a beautiful, beautiful picture of the way the church can work. What a beautiful picture of ministry. That out of the grace that God had given them, they began to give abundantly. They began to give generously. They begged for the privilege of sharing in the ministry to the saints. And not merely as we expected, they gave themselves first to the Lord, and by the will of God, then they gave to us, so that we might urge Titus that as he had already made a beginning, so he should also complete this generous undertaking among you. Now, as you excel in everything, he tells the Corinthian church, you're really good at everything. Well, okay, almost everything, Corinthian church. In faith, in speech, in knowledge, in utmost eagerness, and in our love for you. So we want you to excel also in this generous undertaking. Paul doesn't say, hey, I need you to give to something. He begins to talk about what generosity really looks like. He says that generosity is not about what we give to, but it's about where we give from. Paul says we give from a generous heart, from the grace that God has given us that changed our hearts, that changed our lives. And when we give to, that's fine and dandy, but when we give from, it changes all of us. It changes the way that we experience the world. In fact, Paul uses this word grace in multiple different ways throughout the next 2 chapters. 11 times in the course of these 2 chapters, Paul uses the Greek word charis, which means grace, but it's also translated in different ways. Privilege, generous undertaking, generous acts. Paul goes on and on talking about this idea of grace, seeing that giving from a generous heart is a process of grace. It's something that God does in us, and it overflows out of us. That generosity is responding to God's extravagant generosity towards us. That grace changes us and moves us in such a way that when we give ourselves first to the Lord, when we give ourselves, our hearts to God, now we're able to give from generous hearts. And it moves us beyond just giving to causes. These causes make us feel good, like like these are important things. Please give to a cause. Please give to the church. Please give to whatever it is that moves you. But I would love to see us move from giving to giving from a generous heart. So as people, I don't, look, some of you got these cards in the mail in this last week. If not, you can pick up one on the back. These are our commitment cards to make sure that the ministry and mission of this church continue to go on. I don't sit at home, and when I pray for our church, I don't pray that all of you would turn in a pledge card. Don't get mad, Jeff. I don't pray that everybody would turn in a pledge card. What I pray for is that we would have generous hearts. Because if we have generous hearts, this takes care of itself. If our hearts are moved with compassion, if our hearts are moved with grace, then this takes care of itself. Then we don't have to say, I need you to give to this, I don't need you to give to that, I need you to give to this. We give out of generosity, out of a generous place in our heart. And it's extravagantly more than we expected. That's what Paul says about the Macedonian church, that they're giving from their hearts of grace, from this move of God in them, and it's more than they thought. See, we think that when we have more of this, we'll be able to give more of this. Like we think that's kind of our thinking. Oh, well, as soon as I have more money, I'll be able to give more money. But generosity is not about how much we have to give. It's about how we give what we have. Right? Rich people aren't necessarily generous. Some of them are. Some of them aren't. Doesn't matter how big this dollar sign gets. It doesn't change our hearts. Doesn't change what we give from. Generous people are not worried about how much they have, but about how it is that they give out of a generous heart. That's what Paul says over and over throughout the next two chapters in 2 Corinthians. In chapter 8 and 9, Paul keeps talking about this idea of this generous undertaking that he's encouraging them towards, that this response to grace is a grace, that it comes from our heart, and it moves us beyond what we think we can do. In fact, if we begin to have a generous heart, it reshapes the way that we understand everything that we have. Because everything that we have then is just a gift from God, and it's a gift to be given. It's a gift to be used for God's purposes. We give from a generous heart. And it's a process. I realize this is a process. I realize that moving from a to mentality to a from mentality takes time and intentionality and effort and focus. Especially if you're like me, like now we give through, online bill pay, like we don't ever put anything in the plate because it just comes out of our bank account, and so I don't see it. A lot of folks do that. A lot of people give in that way. We're grateful for all of them, for all the different ways that people give. But it means that every once in a while when I scroll through my bank account to see where all of our money went, I have to pause for a second when I see the one that goes to the church. And I have to be thankful. Grateful that I get to be a part of something. Grateful that I get to give from a generous heart. Grateful that I've been given something that I'm able to give out of. Grateful that I've got this grace in my life that I'm able to grace others with. It means we've got to practice generosity time and time again. If we want to be generous, if we want to have a generous heart, start by acting in a generous way. I was watching a TED Talk not too long ago by a guy named Sasha Dichter, and he's a venture capitalist, which, generally, venture capitalists and generosity don't go in the same talk. But he was talking about this thing that he tried where he just started saying yes to everybody who would ask him for money, which I don't recommend. But he wanted to see what would happen if he just started saying yes to people. And what he found is that it changed the way that he viewed people. It changed his own perspective. It changed his heart. And he said this: if you want the world to be more action-oriented, more open, more generous, then you have to practice being more action-oriented, open, and generous. To do the very thing that we want to experience, we have to experience that grace and be generous. And out of our generosity, our heart becomes more generous. We find over time we're giving from, not to. God's doing something amazing in our hearts and in our lives. And when we give from, God does amazing things. And some of us feel like, well, I'm stuck here. Like this is where my mind is. This is where my brain is. I've only got this much dollar sign. I've got all sorts of thoughts. But all of us really want to be generous people, right? Raise your hand if you want to be a generous person. Okay? Keep them up. A little shoulder workout for us. If you're at home, I hope you're raising your hand. All right? Put it up as high as you can. Okay? Now, put it up a little higher. See, we all have the capacity for more. We just have to be reminded that we have the capacity for more. You guys can put them down now. Great job. You guys really want to be generous. I appreciate that. We all have the capacity to be generous, to live in this way. It just means stretching a little bit, doing something that's a little uncomfortable, reaching beyond what we think we ought to. Be generous. See, it doesn't matter how big this dollar sign gets. It doesn't matter how much we have. It doesn't change the size of our heart. The only thing that changes the size of our heart is experiencing the grace that God gives to us and being a part of this generous undertaking that God is doing in our world around us. I love what Bishop Robert Barron has to say. He says that when we're trying to figure out what God's will is and what God's path is for our lives, like what should we do next? Why should we do things? He says that we should ask this one question: which path makes me the most generous? Which path makes me the most generous? Because the reality is that the why should I, is because God's extravagant generosity towards us should compel us to be extravagantly generous towards others. God's extravagant generosity towards us should compel us to be extravagantly generous toward others. That same charis, that same grace, that same unmerited favor that flows from God's heart to us changes everything. It changes the way we see our finances. It changes the way that we relate to needs in our world and in our community. It changes the way that we connect to the church. It changes the way that we connect to one another. It changes the way that we experience God. Giving to something, giving to, might make us feel good for a short time. But giving from a generous heart will change our lives. Do I hope you'll turn in a card? Yeah, I hope you'll turn in a card. Do I pray you'll turn in a card? No, I pray that God will give you a generous heart. Everything else will fall into place. We'll experience grace in a new way. We'll experience God's goodness in a new way. So if you want to get a card, fill it out, put it in the box, drop it at the office, however you want to get it to us. We're glad to have it. It helps us to budget. But more than that, I want to invite you to come and to pray over the next couple of weeks, to come and to kneel at this altar and not say, God, here's my card, but God say, God, here's my heart. Here's my heart. Make it more generous. Make it more like your heart. Extravagantly generous in ways that change the world.
worship the God who evermore will be. He opened the prison doors, he parted the raging sea. My God, he holds the victory. There's joy. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. And we won't be quiet. No, we shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place. We won't be quiet. No, we shout out your praise. We shout out your praise. We sing to the God who heals. We sing to the God who saves. We sing to the God who always makes a way. 'Cause he hung up on that cross and he rose up from that grave. My God still rolling stones away. Yeah, there's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. And we won't be quiet. No, we shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place. We won't be quiet. No, we shout out your praise. And we were the beggars, and now we're royalty. We were the prisoners, and now we're running free. We are forgiven, accepted, redeemed by his grace. Let the house of the Lord sing praise. 'Cause we were the beggars, 'cause we were the beggars, and now we're royalty. We were the prisoners, now we're running free. We are forgiven, accepted, redeemed by his grace. Let the house of the Lord sing praise. There is joy, there's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. And we won't be quiet, no, we shout